episode of Let's Talk About Mental Health. I'm Nels Kloster, and I'm an addiction psychiatrist working in southern Vermont.
And I'm Robert Stack. I'm a licensed alcohol and drug counselor.
And just a reminder, for your questions or comments, we have a Facebook site and an email address. The Facebook is at facebook.com/letstalkvt, and the email is questions@letstalkvt.com. And tonight our guest in the studio is Beatrice Birch. She is working with a program called Inner Fire, which is a proactive healing community. And we welcome back. And I've had the pleasure to be involved with you as a psychiatrist with this program.
Yep.
And it's nice to have you back.
Thank you, and it is nice to be back. When I was last on the show, we hadn't started, so we're now 3 months open. And I think I'd like to particularly stress that Inner Fire really is about offering a choice. What you choose is your own business, but it's an opportunity for people to be proactive in their healing process, recovering from addiction or mental health issues without the use of psychotropic meds. And yeah, it was very interesting. I've, for over 30 years, worked in holistic practices in Europe and the United States. And I was struck with what I was meeting when I was working at a rehab in Vermont. And I had young people coming to me saying, I hate being medicated, isn't there a choice? You know, and I would have had to lie to say, no dear, just take your meds, when indeed I knew there was a choice. And it was really after the 6th person I knew had committed suicide that I realized enough. The choice has to be visible. And that's how Inner Fire really began. Really. And Inner Fire won't be for everybody, but for people who really want to be engaged and to have help coming off their psychotropic meds. We have a very intense program, a work program, working in the biodynamic garden, in the forest, learning how to cook properly. We're using the GAPS diet, and learning how to housekeep, take care of a home, one's shelter. And those types of things, that work happens in basically the mornings. And then in the afternoons, they're one-on-one therapies. Yeah.
I was reading your newsletter, and one of the things I noticed was that you refer to your clients as seekers.
Yeah.
Which is really a nice term. I mean, I remember, working, do you call them patients, do you call them clients, consumers? I mean, there's all these, and this idea that these people are seeking. Could you say a little bit more about that?
I will. For many years, I worked in prisons in New York City, or New York State, as a volunteer, and doing the AVP, Alternatives to Violence project.
What is AV?
Alternatives to Violence project.
Okay. All right.
And in another prison I painted with men for years. And one day, one young man, wonderful young man, came up to me and said, I was trying to write to a friend on the outside about this art class. He said, it's so hard to describe what happens here. And eventually I wrote, it's an art class, but it's really a spiritual class. And then he said to me, this is what I was looking for on the outside. Isn't it strange I had to come to prison to find it? You know?
Well, we have that same thing, if you don't mind, just for a second. In AA, Alcoholics Anonymous, they have a line in one of the things they were talking about. They say that God could and would if he were sought. And that's always, it isn't that you don't have to find them per se, like, oh, there, I found them, thank God.
Yeah.
But it's the idea of seeking. It's looking for that spiritual life and it unfolds. It does happen, but you have to sort of look for it. You have to.
But my feeling was listening to him and knowing the kind of life he grew up in, and thinking, these people are seeking for something more than our fast-paced, superficial, materialistic life. They want depth. It doesn't mean necessarily religion. But they want substance, they want depth, really. And so I thought, we're not going to call our folks clients, residents, whatever. And it's so interesting, when I refer to somebody as a seeker, there's a shift in their eyes. And they think, you mean I'm not just a schizophrenic? I'm more? And I feel sometimes that's the beginning of the healing, that they're being recognized as a striving, seeking human being.
Yeah, and we've talked about this on the show many times. This idea of these labels, they're very limiting. They are, you know, very tied into this sort of biological way of looking at things.
Yeah.
You know, people talk about, you know, biopsychosocial being a model for treatment, that then it encompasses sort of all the aspects of the person. And really what we've done so much in psychiatry, which is a very common critique, is really sort of bio. Let's look for the place in the brain, let's name the disease, let's have an associated medication with that. And that has been a very sort of limiting treatment, that is sort of what's wrong with me as opposed to maybe what's happened to me, or how can I thrive, how can I be healthy.
Yeah, well, I think it's also, I really would refer to it as not mental health, which I see as a reductionist view of the human being, but really soul health. If different traumas, different things that happen in our life, on a deeper level, we either contract and sort of try to hold it all together, hold myself together, or I flip out. I don't want to be in this body, you know. And so there's this view, and time and again I meet people who say my brain has been damaged by the meds, and it's very interesting because they end up, if they think of it only as the brain, I encourage them to believe that the soul informs the brain. So we can work on a deeper soul spiritual level, and that's going to help the brain to heal. Many people feel, well, if I just sit and do nothing and just wait, you know, people who are coming off their meds or who have been off their meds for a while. But it means they have to be passive because nobody understands the brain. It's scary, so just be passive. And they don't need to be passive. There is so much, the therapies that we offer, which are proactive, they can't be done to you. And the work program and so on. So to awaken, to kindle their inner fire, basically.
You know, when you use a word like soul, you lose a lot of people.
Yeah.
You know, there's been...
I'm thinking people don't like God with AA, and now you're talking about sort of a soul.
Like a soul, and it's a term that's almost become, I got a book at home that I've started to read, and it said it's a cultural shift. And he actually blamed Shakespeare and Freud, believe it or not. He said we got away from this idea of a soul, of morals, of higher calling, if you will, whatever that was. And he ends up being in favor of Blake. Now, I don't know Blake, and I don't know his poetry, but the idea, the thing that strikes me is this, you know, Karl Marx said, you know, religion is the opiate of the people, you know.
Sure.
Well, we got rid of religion, now we just give them opiates. I mean, you know, that's, I know it's a smart remark, but what I mean is that I think what you're saying is so right, that people are looking for something more. People are looking for something that sort of gives a reason, or is part of life, if you will.
Well, see, a very important aspect in Inner Fire is, as you help people to come off their psychotropic meds, you have to replace that with something. Yeah? Because if you just take them off their meds, or take them off their crack cocaine or heroin or something like that, then what they're left with is just the raw pain for going on all of this in the first place. So what we're doing at Inner Fire is, as we help them come off, they're engaged with a form of movement therapy known as eurythmy, or the artistic therapy, which I do, or music therapy, or speech arts, which it's not speech therapy, but it's helping you to claim your voice. And we use a javelin to really articulate and find our voice again after so many years of it being lost, you know.
And I think, you know, we so often, one thing that I was taught within sort of, you know, say general psychiatry, is that all of us find ourselves on a spectrum, even with people who are considered to be sort of disordered, so to speak. So, for example, with compulsiveness, you know, at the far end you might consider to be, you know, obsessive compulsive disorder, OCD, and at the other end, you know, maybe slovenliness, maybe that would be the opposite of being obsessive. And what this professor told us is that we, as sort of medical students, you know, wanted to be doctors, we were not average, we were not down the middle. but we were more towards that compulsive side there, almost verging on abnormal, some of us. And so as you're saying this, I'm recognizing this whole idea of this split or dichotomy of this is well, this is ill. You're talking about things that are really sort of basics that all of us want and all of us are seeking.
Totally.
You know, and I have to admit, you know, I worked in a psychiatric hospital for 29 years, and I was an advocate of meds. And I remember interviewing clients, and you know, and I would tell them that part of their problem was getting off their meds because they would become disorganized, whatever, you know, that idea. And I must tell you, I've had many patients look at me and say, you know, I feel like I'm underwater when I'm on my meds. I feel like I'm walking, you know, the bottom of a pool. And I feel terrible sort of admitting to this, is that on some level I was saying, yeah, but you're safe. You know what I mean? Like you may feel like you're underwater, but you're safe, and you know, we won't worry about you. And you know, I remember Dr. Fisherman coming on and talking about, when we were talking about maybe there's a different way to provide mental health services. She would say, well, not only do you have to change the way you provide services, but you need to change society's cultural ideas and thoughts about what is right for the people who struggle with mental illness. And she didn't even say that. She said people who are different. People who are, you know what I mean? And so that's, I mean, that just seems so interesting to me, you know, because my whole training on some level was about stabilization and, you know, making normal and whatever, you know, whatever way, don't make a mess kind of thing, you know?
I mean, I felt that one of my tasks as a psychiatrist when I was in training was, how do I convince people to stay on the medications? How do I sort of take the positive, you know, perceived positive benefits and the acknowledged, you know, the discomforts or bad side effects of it, and get them to sort of, you know, do the debate to sell them over to the side that the benefits outweigh the negatives of this.
Yeah. Well, you know, I haven't met a single person wrestling with what is called schizophrenia who doesn't have some untold story. And when they admit it, when I say to them, you know, I'm not really interested in your label, you know, I'm much more interested in you as a human being, it's again, they shift. And I say, you know, I imagine you probably have some story that you've never told. And then you begin to lead the split life. Because I have this trauma that I can't expose, and I have to put on a smiling face to get myself through life, apparently, you know. And there's this split. And we all have that to some degree, probably. You know?
And I've noticed too, you know, when you mention schizophrenia, that despite the sort of the oddity that we consider to be part of the thinking when people have this label of schizophrenia, you can still find this common thread that is threads that we all carry in our own narratives and our own relationships, but it just sort of gets to another degree. And so people often think that everything that is said with this illness is nonsense. But really, if you listen to it, there's a lot of sort of common core to what they're struggling with, and where these, you know, hallucinations or paranoid ideas come from has a basis that is not that dissimilar from things that we worry about ourselves or are concerned about ourselves.
And then to put the person in the context of the family. You know, that's also important. Oftentimes someone will say, well, it's my son who's having these difficulties. And we're not talking about blame or judgment or anything like that, but you know, we're a whole organism ourselves. You know, our brain is informed by our soul. You know, what happens on this deeper soul spiritual level will influence the brain. And just like everyone in a family is another organism. And so this or that's going to influence that person in the family. And what I've met time and time again is the fear of the parents and the family members of this particular brother or sister or son or daughter getting well. Because the family dynamic has been created on this person being ill and staying ill.
And you've talked a lot about this in the past, about the various roles that family members play.
Yeah, we obviously, and we see that, and then you take on the sick person role and all that stuff. One of the things that I must say, not to be disagreeable with you, I read that somebody had studied all the words of paranoid schizophrenics and recorded them all. And I'm pretty sure it was a doctor in Europe, and it basically said no matter how much I've tried to listen for the story, I could never hear it. And I don't know what that study, I can't I wasn't there. I don't know the exact study. But one of the things that struck me in one of the Dr. Kloster's magazines, it was saying that people are at different places in their disease throughout their life. And one of the things I think that's a concern is that we tend to want to treat everybody this way.
Exactly.
You know what I mean? And matter of fact, that might have been this way worked for them at 21, or maybe it didn't work at 21, but they're 33 now, or they're 40, or their family is different. In other words, and I'm not so sure. I mean, we mentioned this, and I hope I'm not doing this wrong, but we took people that we put them in asylums, we put them in institutions, and then we deinstitutionalized them. And I mentioned a couple of weeks ago that I read an article about somebody who said, well, why don't we bring back the institutions? Because they sort of work on some level. They have community, they have different things. But it was more this idea that, well, here's what we're going to do now. We're going to use we're going to use medication. We're going to use this, or we're going to use that. And I can't help thinking that what we ought to be thinking about is there's lots of different approaches for different people, different places.
And you know, it's wonderful. At Inner Fire, we have 6 seekers. One day we hope to have 12. That's what we're aiming for. And one young man was telling me every time he splits wood, he doesn't hear voices. Interesting. It's the only time he was at peace with his voices. And we have 2-man saws. All of our people, there's when one young woman arrived, I thought, my goodness, will she even be able to lift an axe? She's been splitting wood 2 hours a day now. And she comes in rosy-cheeked, feeling really good, and it's so grounding. All of these, what I would call will-based activities, you know, they pull them in. If they're sort of way out there, you have to engage them in their will, you know. And
you might find this funny, Beatrice, but when I started my residency in psychiatry, that's also the time I started gardening.
Yeah, to balance.
I'd never done it before. I figured if I'm going to do all this sort of in the head stuff, I really need to kind of get to the earth and get physical and then sort of grounding myself.
Yeah, grounding, I mean, gardening is very helpful for me, too.
Yeah. Now, we talk about choice, and right? I mean, the idea that everybody's in an institution and everybody's out in the community of mental health, and then what some would say, then everybody's in prison, as this sort of shifts around a block. So you're offering alternatives. I mean, choice was a very important word in this. I'm wondering too about gaining legitimacy for the choices that you're offering. I think you've got some status with the state of Vermont.
Well,
right?
We've been recognized as a non-meds-based facility. And we need to raise more money. We're planning to build an Inner Fire home for 12 seekers. And in the ideal world, I would so love for Vermont to use us as a pilot project and sponsor us for 5 years. And we'll have the chance to show them how much money they can save by these people will no longer be on disability, no longer having to be on these psychotropic meds. And actually, their quality of life, they would be able to go back into society and engage. Because what happens so quickly, a simple issue, and I know too many of these stories, a simple issue gets medicated. And one medication leads to another, and that leads to another, and that to another, and soon they're on a whole cocktail of meds. And they were just distressed about their parents' divorce. And it's like, what's the problem? You know, and life, being a human being, is very complicated. And it's as if the medical world or the scientific world is wanting to homogenize us all. You know, as you were saying also, what's right for somebody is not necessarily right for somebody else. We're unique human beings. And it is complicated.
I would love to see you have an opportunity to try. Partly just because, for me, I need to see this to believe it.
Yeah.
I mean, it is so counterintuitive for me, and I don't even know if the word intuitive is right. It's counter what I've learned.
Yeah.
And I think that would be a wonderful thing, because you have to, because it almost sounds like a pipe dream. You know what I mean?
I know.
No, it does really. It sort of sounds like, oh gee, that would be nice, and they would cut wood and all that. But you know, the reality is they need to take their Depakote. You know what I mean, or something to that effect. And I don't mean to be flippant about it, but
but I also don't want to give the impression that it's lovely and easy
Right.
all the time at Inner Fire. You know, we have people who are really struggling. But, you know, if you're coming off your meds and at the same time you have to go out and dig in the garden or saw or something like this, it doesn't matter how well you do it, but that you try to engage, and that's the most important thing. And so many people say it's the rhythm that counts. They get up, they arrive, it's non-residential at the moment, so they arrive for breakfast at 7, and they stay through the whole day until 8:30 at night. Yeah? And they're working in the various different work areas, they're having different therapies. After lunch, there's an hour rest, where everyone goes and lies down. And initially, one of the seekers with us, the idea of lying down was outrageous, you know, but she's settled in and she gets up rubbing her eyes and she's got rosy cheeks and she's just coming into herself, you know. It's very heartening to see what happens. And it's not always easy, for sure, but it's happening. And that's what people are saying. I get emails from all over the world. Australia, New Zealand, Ireland, England, Holland, all over, who are saying, you know, basically go for it, do it, you know, and we have people at Inner Fire from across the country, Hawaii, and all the way east, you know.
So metaphorically, how far a distance do the seekers have to travel, I wonder, going from this sort of limited identity as a client, patient, you know, mentally ill person, to then developing this rhythm and developing a purpose and sort of being independent?
It's almost like, you know, if you give them a chance to build themselves up inwardly, yeah, help them to break habits, old patterns, and reestablish new ones. So much is this sort of relearning, re-engaging. A lot of it is trust, to let go of the props that they've had before. But the rhythm helps to hold them for that, you see.
Now, in the field of addiction and alcoholism, we often would have someone in treatment, and they might even go through a detox. Then they might go to, say, Maple Leaf for 3 weeks for treatment stuff. But then, ideally, we would sometimes be able to offer them a halfway house.
Yeah.
And there used to be this idea that someone would be halfway between hospitalization and on their own. And, you know, a lot of them closed down. There's only a couple left in the state. But it seems like that's something that you would want.
Yeah, we would love to have. You can detox in hospital from cocaine, heroin, whatever. Then come to us, and we would help to establish who that person, who they are, who they're longing to become. And oftentimes we know that addictions and so on are oftentimes linked to trauma in one's life. So one can't take away the trauma, but one can balance it. And even if you can begin to look at your life as if maybe that was an important aspect to my life, simply an opportunity for growth, a challenge. You know, the whole way of looking at life can be different. That maybe that belongs to me. Maybe I needed that experience as an addict. But I don't have to stay there. No. The point isn't to stay, but it's to move through it. Yeah. And then to be able to inspire and encourage others.
Last week we had a guest, I don't know if that's the show that we're showing, but she talked about changing the narrative. You know, changing the narrative from addiction that was focused on the drug to a narrative that was focused on the person. Right. Would that be fair to say?
A person who uses drugs as opposed to an addict being the label of the person.
But one of the things you said earlier, and I thought it was great progress. I remember when you know, people say I'm a schizophrenic or I'm bipolar, we'd say, oh no, you're a person with schizophrenia. And we thought that was great progress. Yeah. But what I hear you saying is just, I'm a person. Well, stop there. Yeah. I mean, you know, because it was almost automatic, like, oh, well, you're just not a person. You also have schizophrenia. We need you to own that, you know. Yeah.
But, you know, to be a human being, I think, is to wrestle with a challenge, isn't it? I mean, really. Don't we all have something we're wrestling with at this time? And so sometimes I'll refer to it as somebody who's wrestling with what is called schizophrenia. Because I know a lot of psychiatrists and all who, they don't really know what schizophrenia is, you know. And then one psychiatrist I know, very well known, man who said once, you think we understand the brain? It's more complicated than the universe. We don't have a clue.
I was reading that yesterday. Somebody said, we can tell you what area of the brain lights up, where fear is. Oh, yeah. But that's not fear.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? They were saying, like, and I can remember my training where people talking to me about the limbic system, and that was the answer for everything. Yeah. That was my moods, my feelings, my emotions. Yeah. What is it? The amygdala?
The amygdala?
The amygdala. There you go. That's been the problem in my life.
The anger center.
Yeah.
But this is to get back to something that says, no, there's more to it than that. It's not just a mechanical misfiring in my brain. It was Robert Whitaker was saying there's no such thing as a chemical imbalance.
Yeah.
Well, I can't tell you how many people walked around talking about a chemical imbalance.
Well,
this idea too, what's wrong with me as opposed to what happened to me.
Exactly.
As we've been critical of the idea of say, mental illnesses being diseases or addiction being a disease, so much of it is really just reactions and responses to our environment.
Yeah. And as a dear friend of mine said once, what sensitive, aware individual would not be depressed today? Look at what's going on in our society, And actually for a lot, I've also worked for many years with younger children, and oftentimes I've had to say to the parent, there's nothing wrong with your child. It's just he or she hasn't toughened up as quickly as other children. He's a more sensitive person, So how do we support them and help them want to engage in life here when there's so much that's unappealing, that's not welcoming to children in our society?
Mm-hmm.
So it almost sounds like, Beatrice, like what you're doing there is really something all of us should be doing. Right, as far as the lifestyle, right? Having routines, having physical work and such, having community.
It's all about balance. All about balancing.
But also, I have to say, you provide them with a loving experience and acceptance.
Sure.
And it's okay to say that. Isn't that okay to say that?
It's referred to as the L word.
The L word.
And I talk about the L word a lot.
It makes a world of difference.
And they know I love them. They know I believe in them.
Yeah.
They know I believe this is just part of their life tapestry. I speak of the life tapestry as having many different tones and colors. Some are deep, dark, hard colors, soft colors, light, playful colors, intense colors. That makes for a really interesting life.
And remember, with a tapestry, the colors may be bright and they may be wide at this point, but later on in the tapestry, they may become almost less. They may become much smaller. And other things take their place within the tapestry. And then, I used to think about that when one talked about history. A good way of understanding history is the flow of history, what Marx used to talk about. But the idea that there are different colors that make it, and where they come from.
Yeah. I remember one woman I worked with came into me one day, just a few years ago, and said, I don't really think there is anything wrong with me. And I had to agree. I said, I don't either. Basically, as soon she wanted to get off her meds, and I could just encourage her, go slowly, go carefully, and at Inner Fire we have a detox. Some people, it might be unfamiliar to many, but there's something called a liver compress. Now we know our liver is the organ which deals with all the poisons. So 3 days a week, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, after lunch, everyone gets a liver compress. And that's a very interesting experience. It's more than the compress, but you actually get, so to speak, wrapped up, cuddled.
Oh, goodness.
And these are things, Robert, that most of us really want, right?
Yeah, I know. We all want it. All these people, And we do the GAPS diet as best as we can, which has to do with our internal flora. And
we're coming to a close, and I wanted to make sure we left you enough time. If you have 30 seconds, 35 seconds, what would you like to share and tell everybody?
Just that I am so grateful that we're actually running, that we're going with that. We can see in just these 3 months we've made a difference in people's lives. They're beginning to blossom, and I couldn't ask for more other than you know, that we can eventually be offering this to 12. And as somebody said, we hope it spreads like wildfire.
Thank you very much. Thank you.